Welcome everyone in the webcast audience. I'm Terry Magedy, the chair of our Elder Law Committee of the Trust and Estates section. And very soon, probably within 24 hours of our program, you should be getting your MCLA certificates via email. And then the first thing we do is thank our sponsors, of course, to show appreciation. And we're fortunate to have quite a few sponsors for our Elder Law Committee. First, Nancy Sanborn and the Sanborn team. They're real estate brokers who specialize in the areas that we deal with, trusts, probates, estates, sales relating to older people. They're a long-term sponsor. So thank you very much, Nancy Sanborn and the Sanborn team. And our second sponsor is here in person to introduce herself.
Thanks, Terry. Hi, everyone. I'm Orit Gadish, broker and owner of Geffen Real Estate, a dynamic brokerage specializing in serving the trust and estate community. I have a team of 25 agents with boots on the ground throughout Southern California. I recently launched my book titled The Practitioner's Handbook for Probate Real Estate. And I'd like to thank those of you who have read it and have written a review. I truly appreciate it. For those of you who have not read it, please take a minute to check it out. It's available on Amazon, and the link is in the chat box. Take a few minutes to read the reviews. If you're interested in reading and providing a review, please text me and I'll have a complimentary copy shipped to you. And if we haven't connected yet, or you need help with an upcoming real estate sale, please feel free to reach out to me and we can schedule a Zoom call to get to know each other. Enjoy your program, and back to you, Terry.
Thanks, Orit. Our next sponsor is Marcine Klein, Glen Oaks Escrow, an escrow company that I've had the pleasure of dealing with and working with, who also another player in our world that deals with trusts, estates, conservatorships, escrows that are really very much geared to all the things we do in our law practice with real estate sales. So thank you, Marcine and Glen Oaks Escrow. Our next sponsor is California Title Company. Once again, a title company that works in our field. Trusts, estates, probates, conservatorships. Thank you very much, California Title Company. And our newest sponsor is Manufacturers Bank, a bank that is also working in our space, so to speak, with administrators, fiduciaries. I know a lot of fiduciaries attend our programs, doing trust and estates work. So Manufacturers Bank, thank you so much for being a sponsor as well. And now for our speaker, I am very pleased, honored to have Tod Lipka here. In my world of elder law, I've known and heard about Step Up on Second, his organization, for many years, and I've always heard just fine things about them, and they have just a stellar reputation. And for me, Tod and they together represent really what happens in the world so often after you've experienced life a bit. You see certain government organizations try to solve problems, but the real problem solvers that, at least in my experience, I see are really nonprofit entrepreneurs. That's what I would call them. Tod and Step Up on Second. What they've done to address this homeless issue in our state, county, city is really tremendous, and the knowledge base he has in this area is tremendous. And as an audience, we're unique in that, of course, homelessness affects everyone, whether you're homeless or not homeless in our region. So it affects everyone. But we have an unusual mix of people in our organization, who not only may know about it, the homelessness, but we're representing family members who have people who are homeless in their family, or representing fiduciaries who have beneficiaries of trusts that are homeless. So we're dealing with the issue from a different perspective than just other people are in our city, county, state community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tod for the presentation today about the homeless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here in Beverly Hills, and for many reasons, and to join the Bar Association for this presentation. I first give you a little thumbnail of Step Up and some of our work, and then I have a formal presentation that really addresses the subject, the topic of today. So Step Up was founded in 1984 in Santa Monica. And today we're a national organization. We're across 4 states here in California and across the Southeast. We serve about 3,500 individuals a year. We have a budget of almost $50 million and some 400 staff. And we're focused as an organization on not just homelessness, but chronic homelessness, which means individuals have been on the street for years, and individuals who are the most disabled, individuals with serious mental health issues and full-blown mental illness. We house, it's very interesting to look at our trend line about housing. Several years ago, we housed maybe 150 people. Then the following years, 250, 500 or 600 last year. And this year, we're looking to house probably somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 individuals just in the upcoming year. We work with many communities, and of course, we have a team embedded in Beverly Hills City Hall. We've been partnering with the City of Beverly Hills for the past 8 years, and the city originally called us in because many years ago, the city's solution to homelessness was to give homeless individuals a bus token to Santa Monica, and that was their solution to homelessness. When we came in, there were about 40 to 45 chronically homeless individuals sleeping in the various parks of Beverly Hills. And over the first several years of that, we've reduced that population by about 75% by getting housing for those individuals. And in fact, Steve Lopez of the LA Times wrote an article about somebody we house. We have a project on Vine Street near Santa Monica Boulevard. This is a 36-unit permanent supportive housing project. And one of the individuals that moved in there was somebody that Steve Lopez wrote about, which was John G. He was also known as Crazy on Robertson. So you may know him. He danced on the corner of Robertson and I think 3rd Street, homeless for 30 years, danced on the street corner. And he actually comes from a pretty well-to-do Beverly Hills family. Through years and years of his homelessness, there were many people who maybe gave him handouts, maybe provided him with a blanket, maybe some spare change, maybe some food, but nobody ever solved his fundamental problem of homelessness with a home until we engaged him and he moved into Step Up on Vine. And he moved in 2013, and he's housed there still. What is it now, 8 years later? So that's partly what I'm going to talk about, which is the answer to homelessness. It's a simple equation, and it may seem obvious, but it's housing. So when we look across the landscape of homelessness in Los Angeles, over 60,000 individuals are homeless on any given night. That's a point in time count, but we know that the point in time counts, actually the true number may be as many as 3 times the number of individuals, but I don't need to tell you that, right? All you have to do is drive around the streets of Beverly Hills or LA or other parts of the city or the county, and visible homelessness just seems to be increasing. The tents, the structures that are built. And when we look at the homeless population, I'm going to make a generalization relative to 80% and 20%. Of those who are homeless, about 80% will need short-term support to get back on their feet. They may be individuals through a loss of a job, a health situation, fell off the cliff of housing into a state of homelessness, and they don't need long-term support. What they do need is interim help to get them back on their feet so that they can reestablish their independence. But 20%, which is the 20% that we're focused with as an organization, they're homeless because they have a disability. It could be a physical disability. In our case, it's a mental disability of mental illness or serious mental health issues. Could be substance abuse, and it's going to be probably an intersection of 2 or 3 of those. So since they have a disability, they're not going to get housed, reestablish their lives, get a full-time job, and move to a level of independence. They're going to need long-term supportive housing. And we work with the 20%. And when you look at the homeless population, we define as the chronic, which HUD defines as 1 year or more of homelessness. But that's really a pretty diverse group of individuals because we've housed people 10, 20. In the case of John, who moved into Vine, 30 years of homelessness. We've even housed several people who've been on the street for 40 years, if you can believe that. But these are also the individuals who are most expensive to society. They're the individuals who law enforcement engages with, the courts, the jails. You know, LA County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the country. They go to the ER for their health care. They're really the most expensive individuals. And you may want to read an interesting article by Malcolm Gladwell called $1 Million Murray. And Gladwell studied this one individual, Murray, who was homeless in the city of Reno, Nevada, for 8 years. And he calculated the cost to the city over those 8 years. So this was somebody the police knew. In fact, he was so repetitive in terms of his engagement with these expensive systems of care that the cop on the beat where he lived ended up marrying one of the ER nurses. He got taken to the ER so often. So Malcolm Gladwell calculated the cost and said that over those 8 years, he cost the city of Reno $1 million. You'll get all the time of police, the time of ER, and all the government systems he engaged with, $1 million. So the city spent 8 years, $1 million, and they still had no outcome. He was still homeless. So there was no positive outcome with that investment. So what is the answer? The answer is what we call permanent supportive housing. That is housing infused with services. I'll refer that to that as PSH moving forward. So PSH, we know that you provide housing without any services, people will fail in that system and they'll go back on the street. If you provide services without housing, you're never fundamentally solving an individual's fundamental problem. In the case of John, homeless for 30 years, and I think, in fact, somebody did crazy on Robertson t-shirts and made money off him. So no matter what you provide to someone over time, if you don't provide a home, you're really perpetuating homelessness. And there are many nonprofits historically that have provided outreach and engagement, providing a blanket, a meal card. But if they're not addressing the person's homelessness, they're enabling a system where people stay homeless. A little bit about the system of care for those who are homeless. The traditional housing and homeless system, what Zev Yaroslavsky used to call the shelter industrial complex. That traditional system really said that it's a tiered system and it's a step system. So as you succeed at one step, you go on to the next step. So somebody would be engaged through outreach on the street. And then the first thing you would do traditionally is to move into a shelter, an emergency shelter. And those typically would be months, up to 6 months. And probably most of you haven't been in a shelter, but I can assure you they are not pleasant places to live. So that's not a great place to start out if you're trying to help somebody who's homeless. But that traditional system said, okay, you go into a shelter for months. Let's see if you can navigate that successfully. And if you do, then we'll consider you for transitional housing. And that can go up to 18 months. And that's going to have rules. And if you show that you can comply with those rules for that period of time, then we'll consider you for your own apartment. So we're talking over 2 years that somebody may be going through a program before they can ever be considered for their own apartment. So this is a diagram about what that system would look like. You're homeless on the street. You go into a shelter. There are various services, food and showers, health services, mental health services. And if you get those services in the shelter then, and you're successful, you go into the transitional program. You may get closed donations, if somebody helps you with your benefits. You may get support groups or substance abuse counseling. You may get therapy, medication support, various support groups, educational services. So there are a whole variety of services that may intersect with you on the way finally to the culmination of permanent housing. So this is a traditional system that we looked at that was available to somebody who was homeless. So to succeed in that system, you must navigate the system sequentially. And there are high barriers. There are rules that have to be complied with. You have to fit into the system. And what that essentially meant was those who needed help the most, those who were going to die on the street without housing, were the least likely to succeed in this system because they couldn't simply navigate the system. As attorneys, you know that if you're trying to penetrate the bureaucracy, it's difficult enough to penetrate that if you're not disabled. So imagine trying to penetrate all those systems and abide by their rules if you're managing complex challenges in your life. So those most likely to die were least likely to get this help in the traditional system. And the least likely to die in the street, the non-chronic homelessness individuals, they learned they can manipulate the system. They may say they have a mental health issue because they know that that will trigger the resources they need so that they're most likely to succeed in that system. So the traditional system was upended by something called Housing First. It was developed by somebody named Samson Burist on the streets of New York. And it turned that traditional system of the tiered system on its head. And by the way, Housing First is an evidence-based practice, which means there's lots of research to show that it succeeds. And it essentially says, let's put the consumer at the center of the system. You know, the traditional system put the system in the center of resources, and then homeless individuals revolved around that and tried to intersect at various places to get those resources. Housing First changed that paradigm and said, no, we're going to put the consumer, the homeless individual, at the center of the system and revolve the resources around that individual so that all of them intersect in a way and are brought to bear when they can be helpful to the individual. Housing First really said, it's not always about housing first, it's about putting the consumer first, about what the consumer wants, and then partnering with them. But in most cases, that's housing. So many people think homeless people don't want housing. Why is that? Why would people think that? Just by way of example, we have a project in Santa Monica right at 5th and Colorado. So if you can imagine that, the train station is right there for the light rail. 2 blocks away is the Santa Monica Pier, and within blocks of the ocean. And I was giving a tour to the editorial writer for the LA Times. We were standing on the 5th floor balcony in the front of the building, and you could see the metro rail station, you could see the pier, you had ocean views. And she said to me, you know, I have to ask you, because people say to me, well, I'm middle class, I can't afford to live in Santa Monica. So why should a homeless person be able to live not only in Santa Monica, but just a couple blocks from the ocean? That's a very privileged opportunity. Why should homeless people live there? And I said to her, well, think of it this way. When somebody became homeless because of mental health issues, substance abuse issues, physical health issues, the system failed them to get the resources they needed that would have changed the trajectory of falling into a state of homelessness and into a state and keep their housing. So because the system failed them at that point in time to give them the system resources, they became homeless. And I can tell you in the mental health system, it's failed miserably to get people the resources they need before they fall into a state of homelessness, before their family gives up on them, before they have no structure in their life. And not only that, did we fail them whenever that happened, but now we blame them and we say it's their fault that they're homeless, that they don't want housing. The fact of the matter is, homeless individuals, they want a home. Living on the street is a state of misery. There's nothing glamorous. There's nothing fun about it. We housed one individual who was homeless 15 years. He tried to commit suicide multiple times. He laid down in the middle of the road hoping a car would run him over. He was so hopeless, so desperate, so depressed of his situation. The problem is, in a perception situation, is that it may appear homeless individuals don't want housing because they've been hardened, like John, who was homeless for 30 years. So many people coming up to him, giving him hope over those 30 years, offering him something, maybe never showing up the next day. I can guarantee you that if you or I were in that situation, we would have hardened exteriors to any assistance of help because we would have given up. We would have become so frustrated, in fact, bitter about our situation and what isn't happening, that we would have given up hope. And I can tell you that many people have been on the street. They no longer have hope of housing at all. It's out of their frame of reference. So you may be surprised to learn that not only do homeless individuals want housing, but the vast majority, I would say 98% of those who are on the street, if you gave them a home, you said, here are the keys, you dangle the keys right in front, your apartment is right down the street, 98% of those individuals would take it. So this was the traditional system. This is what Housing First looks like. From homelessness right into permanent supportive housing. So when you put the consumer at the center and you revolve all the resources around them that they need, people succeed in tremendous numbers. So you put the individual at the center, and then you provide all these resources over time for whatever they need on a consumer preferred basis. So in the step-up world, working with chronically homeless individuals, many with serious mental illness, one of the standard measures is retention. And retention is measured by, you move somebody into housing, that's day one. At the end of 1 year, are they still in housing? People like John, 30 years. Other people who are 2, 5, 10, 15 years of homelessness. The retention rates, you may think, are not that great. I mean, we've seen for homeless veterans in other areas of the country a 50% retention rate. In many nonprofit homeless organizations, an 80% retention rate is good. For Step Up, we have a 97% retention rate, which means 97 out of 100 individuals, once they're housed 1 year later, they're still in housing. And we use 1 year because the first year of housing is very, very challenging. It's a huge adjustment because all the survival skills that people are able to survive on the street in a state of homelessness, none of those skills are actually very good or very functional once you're in a housed environment. We had one individual who was homeless for many years on the streets of LA. He moved into one of our housing projects in Hollywood. And we got reports after he was housed that he would yell at 2 or 3 in the morning. And it was very disturbing, not only to his neighbors, but to adjacent buildings. There were families living in there. Well, the reason he would scream at night was that was his way of staying safe on the street. He would scream at night in the morning, and people would stay away from him because who wants to go near a screaming person? It's quite fearful of that. So that was very functional for him when he was homeless. But we had to work with him and say, oh, well, you don't need to scream to stay safe. stay safe, all you have to do is lock your door. If you lock your door, you have the same safety as if you would scream at night. And sure enough, it took about a week and a half or 2 weeks, but he tapered off and he stopped screaming. So those are all the adjustments that happen when an individual moves into housing. We often find it's not unusual for someone to sleep on the floor for a year, up to a year after they've been housed. So that's what we do in terms of the rich, intensive supportive services when someone moves in is how do you clean your apartment? How do you cook? How do you shop? How do you budget? All those things somebody really didn't have to do when they were living on the street. But when you do that, individuals succeed. And then what we look for is to build social capital for an individual after they've made that transition, getting a part-time job, doing volunteer work, maybe taking a class, joining some faith activity, doing volunteer work. And it's building that social capital, and it's about belonging to a community in a new way. And the more places you belong, the more things you're involved in, the more rooted you are, the more social capital you have, and the more likely you are to succeed in housing. But our housing system is completely broken, and it's simply too expensive to develop housing, and it takes too long in Los Angeles. And in fact, in LA, when you develop new housing, it costs 600 grand per unit. That's per unit. And that could be a studio apartment. And it doesn't matter whether it's rehab or new construction. And it takes up to 6 years to develop a project, whether it's a 30-unit project, a 50-unit project, a 100-unit project. So think about the insanity of that. To build government-funded housing, it takes 6 years and costs 600 grand per unit. But why is it so expensive? Well, one of the reasons is because of your colleagues. You know, attorneys representing all the investors, and these are all government investors. And the whole housing finance system is really built on risk reduction. It's not built on getting housing online as quickly and as inexpensively as possible to house individuals. It's based on many government funders, all funding in one project, and all those funders reducing their risk to ensure there's not failure. So that makes it more expensive, and it means it takes more time to get these projects online. With this existing housing finance system, and it uses things like tax credits, which were developed, I believe, during the Reagan administration, in which private entities like corporations can contribute significant financing for this permanent supportive housing. It's an old way of doing things that just no longer fits the homeless situation, not only in Los Angeles, but around most major cities of the country. And it's literally like bailing out a leaking boat with a teaspoon. It's an inefficient tool to address the current problem that we have. By way of example, I'll give you a tale of two programs. The City of LA Measure H, HHH. I'm sorry, it's actually not Measure H, it's HHH. Measure H was the county. So HHH compared to the state-funded program last year of HomeKey. So HHH was passed in 2016, I believe, and the goal was to get 7,500 units online. The appropriation, $1.2 billion. It was a bond passed by the city. Now, HHH used the traditional financing system. So HHH funded, and we have 5 HHH projects. It provided about 150,000 per unit of the 600,000. So it really went the traditional financing route. So we had to go and get tax credit investors. We had to get county grants and others, what we call layering, because there are multiple government investors. Because out of the 600, if the city's only giving us 150, we've got to raise another 450,000 per unit for the project. So this HHH is going to generate about 7,500 units, and they'll take about 6 years. Remember I said it was 2016? So maybe 1,000 HHH units of the 7,500 have come online because they're stuck in the financing. They're stuck in the various components of this traditional financing system for housing. Now, they'll all come online, but it could be more than this 6 years, could be 7 or 8 years, and it will bring 7,500 units. Now, compare that with California Home Key, which was passed by Governor Newsom last year. And the goal was to create 6,600 units, so fairly commensurate with HHH. The investment, $750 million, fairly close to HHH. The cost per key was $175,000, not $600,000 per unit, but $175,000 per unit. And the home key units will come online in 2 years. So we're looking at a third of the cost and a third of the time period. Why is that? Well, the simple reason is that HHH focused on the traditional system, whether rehab or new construction, and the Home Key program focused on motel conversions. Why motels? Well, there are motels across every city of California. Motels convert very easily because the motel room converts to a studio apartment by dropping in a modular kitchenette and doing a refresh on the room. Motels have no tenants, so there's no relocation issues, which often slow down the project. And motels also are in vibrant commercial areas, so they have access to amenities, and they're typically homeless individuals who are on the streets in those communities. And finally, motels are often nuisances in local communities. You know, we bought a motel on Western that went with rates by the hour, not by the day. And it was actually boarded up by the city because there was drug dealing going on pervasively there. And the city shut it down and literally boarded it up. And we've converted that into housing. So motels make very good models for converting into housing quickly and cheaply. Now, one of the great things that the state program did is that they waived the environmental requirements, which was a big factor. And also they waived the change of use. When you convert a motel into housing, you often have to go through an administrative or conditional use permit process. And the state built into the legislation that waived that local change of use. But that's what it took to get units online faster and cheaper. So the focus on motel conversions, a third of the price, a third of the time. Now the third of the price is a little bit skewed because it was throughout California. So we know the price for motels outside of LA is probably going to be much cheaper than what you find in Los Angeles. Motel units were about $140,000 per unit on acquisition for the ones that we bought. So that when you go outside of LA to the more rural or smaller cities, the price per unit is going to go down. So that brought down the average. But still, it became a pathway to getting units online faster and less expensively. Now, the legislature and the governors passed Home Key for this year 2.0. And now there's some $4 billion over the next couple of years allocated to create some 43,000 units across the state. So the traditional system, as I said, is broken. What we really need is innovation. And Home Key leads the way on that, of looking at units in non-traditional ways from non-traditional developers. And it's all about not only faster and cheaper, but how do we scale housing? That really is the key. As Philip Mangano says, and he used to run the White House Interagency Council on Homelessness under President Bush and Obama. And he said, we know what to do. It's about permanent supportive housing. And we know how to do it. We know how to build it. We know how to infuse it with rich supportive services. What we really need to do is scale it, because the traditional system, as you see with HHH, past 6 years ago, we're still seeing less than a seventh of the units coming online at a cost of $600,000. That's simply not the answer. So it's about innovation. It's about home key. It's about motel conversions. And now it's about the next and best practices of looking at modular. How do we scale modular housing? And that may mean getting publicly owned land repurposed for this. You know, the field of permanent supportive housing developers are a little bit like herding cats. You know, they all want to go their own direction from a design perspective to put their specific imprint on that. But what we really need to do is reduce uniquenesses and customization and move to generalization and scaling by standardizing modular construction. Because if we can get to a certain threshold of capacity and production, the cost of modular will continue to come down. And we can see large modular projects throughout the state. It's about thinking about whatever resources, malls, as you know, probably West Side Pavilion closed down as a shopping mall and got repurposed for offices and housing, I believe. Looking at office parks that are under you, and especially, you know, COVID presented a special opportunity for motels because their business really went down as a result of COVID. So it's about looking for all these opportunities, unused government property, manufactured homes. That's the famous trailer park. Those are at the factory, they're standardized and they meet state approval, which means they don't have to go through local zoning and building and safety approval. When you do a manufactured home park, you put on the foundation, you put on the roof, and you connect in the electrical and gas and other utilities. And it streamlines the project because it doesn't have to be approved by the local jurisdiction, building and safety department. So it's really about thinking out of the box. We do know what to do and we know how to do it. And we really only have to think about scaling. And the problem is this has to be done, as Terry was talking about, outside of government, because government will never be innovative in this way. Government will never go all in on these solutions. Government will never think innovatively. So that innovation has to be done outside the government system. And in that government system, in the housing system, there are three resources that are required. You need the money for acquisition and capital. You need a housing voucher or a rental subsidy because these individuals are all low income and cannot afford to pay their rent. And then you need the funding for services. Now, government has typically been in all three, but we think the pathway to scaling is through private and public partnerships, where the private partnership takes on the acquisition and rehab responsibility because the private sector has an incentive to get these units online quickly and cheaply. And I've even had conversations with major investment houses, Fortress, Oaktree, about how to get scaled resources from the investment side to do not simply 30 projects at a time or 50 projects or 100 units, but thousands of units, just like HomeKey. So we really need to think innovatively to scale housing using the private investment side. And then the government can take care of the vouchers, the other two components, the rental subsidy and supporting the long-term services for the projects. Our total focus should be on scaling because we're never going to build our way out of this homeless situation using the current financing system that we have. It's simply an old tool that has not outlived its usefulness, but is no longer the best tool we have to address the problem. And you need to go no further than driving along most streets of Los Angeles to see that as homelessness has increased and we've thrown money at it, we threw a 1.2 billion through HHH, about 400 million a year under the county's Measure H. So we've been throwing billions of dollars at the problem just here in Los Angeles, and it hasn't made things any better. In fact, it's made things worse. So it's not about simply throwing the money, but throwing the money wisely at it with a solution that scales quickly and efficiently. And I think the pathway to that is clearly the private-public partnership for services in this model of affordable housing. In my world, there are many homeless service organizations. And unfortunately, if they're not part of the solution, that is of scaling, you can kind of say they're part of the problem. And for many years, they've actually enabled this state of homelessness. And I'm sad to say that many of my colleagues in other mental health agencies, and in fact, mental health as a field has never seen homelessness as their issue. And I know for many years, there'd be many mental health agencies, they send some of their staff onto the street. They would engage with homeless people who had a serious mental illness. They provide support and therapy on the street. At the end of the day, they'd leave and go home. The person would go back to sleeping in the bushes. They wouldn't see their role as solving the fundamental problem of their client, which is their state of homelessness. Housing and developing housing is a complicated, challenging business. And I think mental health said, oh, that's really not something we want to do. And that's why the status quo has really just perpetuated this inefficient system that has allowed the problem to grow at such a magnitude that almost people are giving up because it's so bad. But it's not so bad that we can't solve it, but it really takes everyone working together and thinking outside the box and drawing all these resources. In Los Angeles, there was a recent report funded by many foundations that looked at where would the answer be in solving homelessness in Los Angeles. The report concluded that the problem in Los Angeles is not a lack of leaders. The problem was actually there were too many leaders. The city did HHH, which was supposed to be the capital side of housing. The county did Measure H, which was services. There's a city-county governmental agency that is a funnel for HUD funds called LAHSA, or the LA Homeless Service Authority. They're going one way, the city goes this way, LAHSA goes this way, the county goes this way. There's philanthropy, which goes in their own direction. There's United Way, which is headed another direction. We have every organization and every nonprofit heading in their own direction, protecting their own turf, and siloed from a common solution. So there's no captain of the ship in Los Angeles. There's nobody unifying resources, saying, here's our plan. This is what our goal is. This is what we're going to achieve, and dynamically track our progress and be accountable for those outcomes and be able to dynamically allocate resources to achieve those outcomes. We have a lot of silo compartmentalized agents and entities going in their own direction. And that's why you see the problem getting worse on the streets of Los Angeles. Mental health goes one way, physical health goes another, substance abuse goes another. There's no unifying source. And I would say, in fact, you could say that there's dysfunction in our system in Los Angeles for really thinking about how to do it. And it's vested interests, just like the vested interests in housing financing, in which everyone is primarily concerned with reducing their risk. So vested interests across our entire homeless resource system means that we are running in place. We're like that mouse on the treadmill. No matter how fast we run, we don't seem to really get anywhere in terms of making progress. I see there's a question in the box. So Linda asked, what about private-public partnerships, and more importantly, maybe this was before, and more importantly, intervening at an earlier stage to identify at-risk individuals before they become homeless? Yeah, so those are very good points. I've talked about the private-public partnerships, and I really think those are the only pathway to scaling. And then you not only have to help people at the back door of homelessness to have them exit homelessness into housing, but you also have to stop the front door. So you're exactly right, Linda. Santa Monica actually has funded an organization called West Coast Cares, and their primary role, they're actually funded by the police department, interestingly. I know in the city of Santa Monica, the police chief told me several years ago, 60% of police calls are homeless related. So this organization provides a service, I forget what it's called, but it's essentially homecoming, that they look at individuals who are recently homeless, either on the beaches of Santa Monica or the streets of Santa Monica, and they will repurpose that individual to go back to their home community, wherever they came from, and say, set up resources, they'll arrange transportation, they'll arrange whatever social capital they had there, whether it's family or friends. In most cases, they had help and support and housing in those communities. So they'll send individuals back. We need a scaled program at that too. And that program actually in Santa Monica has housed more individuals than any other program, more people than we've housed in Santa Monica, because they could send people back home, and they house them all outside of Santa Monica. We've housed people who are Santa Monica residents because they are homeless for so long on streets of Santa Monica that they are actually Santa Monica residents. So that's a very successful program, and that's a way to address people coming in the front door. And we know actually that's a very common problem in destination cities, not only Santa Monica, but Hollywood, where people go to pursue their dreams and they run out of money after 2 or 3 months, and then suddenly they're on the street. And that's also particularly true with a young adult homeless population. We find that most young adults are homeless because of violence in the home. They're transitioning out of foster care. There's gender issues that they've had conflicts with, and that has led to homelessness. So the important thing is to have a really early intervention, especially with young adults, before they become part of the chronic population. And also with the non-chronic, intervening as soon as possible. And in most cases, rather than utilize scarce resources here in Los Angeles to house them, is to ensure that they go back home where they do have some social capital, because they have no social capital here. So maybe I'll just pause for a minute. I can see there's
let's see, let me get on. We had one more, let's see, we had one question that was over in the chat section, and then I'll add some questions too for our time, unless anyone else has them. Someone asked if you could talk a bit more why government is not innovative and the innovation doesn't come from government.
Well, if you're familiar with the civil service system, it does not incentivize risk-taking or innovation. It incentivizes, if you've ever been to the DMV, you know what I mean. It really incentivizes traditional, known, no risk, keep your head low, and nobody gets penalized for not doing something in many cases. You know, I have to say, unfortunately, you look at the VA system, and that's rampant in the VA system, is an unwillingness to take a risk and to keep things status quo as much as possible. So government is not going to be the source of innovation. And then additionally, even when you do get really strong leaders, like I think Xavier Slosky was a very strong leader on the issue of homelessness at the county, but by virtue of the election system, somebody's moving off. We've had very strong leaders in the city too, Mitch O'Farrell, Mike Bonin, but the system itself, unfortunately, is designed to, people move on. Zev termed out, and he was probably the best leader on homelessness. Also, once government, they'll take 2 or 3 years to look at a pilot program to see if it works. And by the time they get the results and they say, oh my gosh, it did work, then they moved on to something else. And they never really go all in terms of resources. The exception being HomeKey. That's why Governor Newsom he is the homeless czar for the state. He's taken on that role to be the czar across the state. And the HomeKey program has really been a national model. So now HUD has earmarked in $5 million that they're funding throughout the country. They've earmarked motel conversions based on what HomeKey has done. Then from Rachel, I see what would a successful private partnership look like in your opinion? So I see the private sector, I'll take the HomeKey example. This has to be a partnership. The HomeKey has to be submitted to the state, but it has to be submitted by the city or the county. But it's co-submitted by the private entity. So one of our investors, we'll probably do 20 or 30 HomeKey projects. So on the private side, it's a partnership with the jurisdiction to submit the HomeKey. Then once it's approved for funding from the state, so the government, the public funder is the investor on the capital, which is the acquisition and rehab. I'm sorry, the private investor takes ownership. So the private investor could be on the capital. HomeKey is the exception on that. The private side is the investor on the capital for the acquisition rehab, and then the government funds the vouchers and the service dollars. So if you could get the major investment houses, the chair of the investment committee for CalSTRS is on my board, and that's one of the things he's looking at is how do you get major investment houses, billions in investments, to invest in this to provide the kind of return, maybe a modified reduced return, but to get major investors at scale on this, and then look at the government invest in all the services and the housing subsidies, because those are long-term, and that's what they do very well. That's what their business is, because the housing authorities across every city get government HUD funds, and they do the vouchers and the rental subsidy. And then the counties typically fund the services. So keep government in that, and with the exception of HomeKey, let the private sector do all the acquisition and rehab, because we know they can do that at scale. We've seen that in the private sector with rental housing, just doing major investments and getting not just 50, 100 units online, but thousands.
Let's see. I'm going to check if we have more, and then I'll add some. The vision, we have Cassandra who's asking, if you see that question, it's a little complex, but we've got one. Todd, if you see Cassandra's question there, or should I repeat it? You see it? No. That's our next one, I guess.
Thank you, Cassandra. So I would say, how do you envision the coordination of the many programs that are needed? So in my world, when Step Up does a housing project, and we have 12 with another probably 20 or 25 coming online in the next year or two, we handle all the services, that government funded service component. So it's an intense service provision. So we have one full-time staff per every 20 residents, and that staff person works exclusively with the tenants in that building. So a 60 or 70 unit building would have 3 full-time staff that just works with the individual tenants. So their role is to provide all the services directly, the cooking, the shopping. We'll be alongside someone, help them clean their apartment to demonstrate those skills. They'll take them out shopping. They'll go sit with them in the Social Security disability office as they apply for disability income. But what they'll also do, not only that hands-on, is work in coordinating services with all outside providers. So maybe they go to the VA for their healthcare. We'll take them to the VA. If they need employment services, we're going to help link them up with employment services. So there's a lot of linkage. So that's really our role, is to work with that individual dynamically over time and provide everything that they need and help train them on the skills to access those services. And so what we do know is that the cost of individuals in terms of the intensity of services as they're housed goes down the longer they're housed. What we do see, the only trend line that goes up, and by the way, their utilization of police calls, 911, jails, courts, all that trends down as people are housed longer. What trends up is utilization of the mental health system. So psychiatric support for meds, mental health clinicians. That's the outcome we want to see. Cassandra also asked, are the necessary regulations and standardization you mentioned already in place? No, they're not. And it's something various people have looked at, but we really haven't made headway in that. If remote work frees up more office space, would you see a potential for repurposing? Absolutely. Office space is a little more challenging, but I think we have to look at every single resource that is available that is sort of an opportunity at that point in time. And just like HomeKey did with the environmental release and the change of use release, we also have to think about on the government regulation side, how do we clear the pathway to those barriers to repurposing office space into housing? Because we can't just use the same system. You know, interestingly, I'll tell you briefly, when one of my first projects that I did in Santa Monica, 46 unit studios, all studios on 5th Street. At that time, the parking requirement was the same if you were doing special needs housing, permanent supportive housing, you were doing affordable housing, you were doing market rate housing. It was half a space per unit. So we had to build 23 spaces, and we've had 0 tenants with cars. So we had to go to the expense of parking, even a subterranean. So the thinking about these things and clearing the pathway in terms of government regulation on the key issues is really important. It's a waste of time and resources to put in parking in a homeless project where nobody has a car. Seems obvious, doesn't it?
And I'll mention, let's see, we've got a few more minutes. I'm going to throw out a couple more issues. One, there's a perception that the Section 8 vouchers, subsidies are so limited that they're not there, but they are there, I suppose, the way you're speaking about that in some fashion, because that's coming from Washington. That's question number one. What would you like to comment on that?
So those are called vouchers, and there are various kinds of vouchers. There's a VASH voucher, which is for a homeless veteran. I can tell you in Los Angeles, there are about 2,400 unused VASH vouchers because you can't find the homeless veterans, even though we know there are almost 4,000 homeless veterans on the streets of the county of Los Angeles. For non-homeless veteran vouchers, there's been a significant infusion from HUD of vouchers. And so we have to think about focusing those resources on the individuals who need them the most. From my perspective, the chronically homeless. So we are seeing an infusion of those resources. Maybe not as many as we need, but there are more resources that are becoming.
The other question was, it sounds like it's hopeful. A lot of the things you say. If you look around the world at our issues, even though with all the obstacles, it still is hopeful. And we've seen how bad things on the street have gotten, the past 5 years, 10 years. How bad does it get when people don't really address this problem? Could you look at a place somewhere else that in the world where they're not addressing it and it becomes almost dystopian?
Yeah, in so many other countries in the world, homelessness is a real community issue. So the community really mobilizes to address it in a way, but also we do have to say, so you see lots of countries that are much more effective than we are, but the scale of their issue is so much smaller relative to the cities in our country. I think Finland has gone a long way towards solving homelessness, but their numbers are so small compared to what we experience. And what we're finding in our major cities, and I would say in Los Angeles, is not years, but decades worth of improper management and implementation of really an outcome-based solution. And so the problem is just magnified because it's been decades in the making. And it's going to take, I hope not decades, but it's going to take a while to solve it. And I'm so happy to hear that you thought mine was an optimistic presentation.
I'm an optimist. Maybe I was an optimist because my first job out of college was with Zev, who's also an optimist. So, but it's optimistic because you're describing solutions, and I guess the dystopian, the stick with that carrot of optimism is all the things we see, it's just going to get more and more and more. There'll be more homeless on the street.
Yeah. Unless we change our system, we're an army marching with many resources straight towards the cliff. Unless we rethink the direction we're heading from a solutions perspective.
Wow. Anyway, we're at the end of our hour, but just incredible presentation, Tod. It was, I learned a lot, and I'm sure every one of the people that attended learned a lot too. And hopefully it'll inspire us, to do whatever we can in a small way to help out with this, the challenge. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, everyone in the webcast audience. We'll see everyone at the next program.